very fortunate to be joined by Professor Stephen Mumford to speak about the topic of emergence and demergence. Stephen is the Professor of Metaphysics at the University of Nottingham and is author of books such as Getting Causes from Powers and A Very Short Introduction to Causation and A Very Short Introduction to Metaphysics. Not only are these books very short, they are also very cheap and very good. So if this webinar today piques your interest in these questions, I would recommend getting those books. They are very, very good. Also, we are fortunate during our recent Causal Powers conference to have been able to take a few minutes of Stephen's time and do a short interview on questions of causation, on questions of emergence, questions of disposition, and also a short interview on nothing, which will be up on our YouTube site, which you can access through our website. For the webinar today, you will have also received a handout, which will also be on the screen. It should be in your inbox right now. It is a step-by-step, point-by-point outline of today's talk. And just one point on this handout, it's actually in a particular format, which has been called the Mumford method. After our speaker today, I have found it a really, really good way of thinking through, planning, and speaking to the topic that you're working on at the moment. If you Google Mumford method, you'll find this particular format and the logic and reasons behind it. As I said, I found it very, very useful just for setting out my thoughts clearly, writing papers, writing chapters, and preparing for presentations. This webinar is in our series of engagements with critical realism and various topics, such as causation, such as powers, such as emergence, such as social structures. And after this webinar, we actually have another webinar scheduled for Thursday, April 28th at 12 noon, in which our very own Margarita Moon will be talking about the relationship between critical realism and methods. I would recommend definitely. From me, I'll hand it over to Stephen Mumford now, and he'll be speaking for about 30 minutes. Then I'll come back online and we'll begin the question and answer. So, Stephen, it's all yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Tim. So I'm on Skype from a hotel in Scandinavia, and I'm relying on the hotel Wi-Fi, so I hope it holds out for us. So this paper on emergence and demergence comes out of work that I've been doing with my frequent collaborator, Ranilil Anyam. And it's work we've been thinking about together. I would say I'm relatively new to the topic of emergence. I know there's a vast literature on it, and I know there are some people with an awful lot of expertise on this. So I'll admit straight away that I'm a newcomer. But I hope I've got some interesting ideas that I can share with you, because I'm very keen to give us a strong metaphysical account of emergence. So one of the problems I've found when I've started reading the literature is that people are often talking at cross purposes, and some people deny emergence, some people accept emergence, but often they're not talking about the very same thing. So I think before we even get to that question of whether emergence is true of the world or not, we need to understand what exactly it would be for there to be emergent phenomena in the world. And so the talk I'm giving is very much in that spirit, although I would say to put my cards on the table right from the start. I think once we have in mind an account of emergence, I do think that there are emergent phenomena in the world, some of which, for instance, are social phenomena. So let me go through the handout and explain some of the things that I think are important. So first of all, just to introduce some of the basic concepts, although I know these may be familiar to many of you, but just so we can summarize them. So emergent phenomena, I think, are understood in some sense to be higher level than that from which they emerge. There's also a sense in which nothing that's in the lower level or base level phenomena entirely determines the interactions at the higher level. So this gives us some sense that the higher level, the emergent phenomena, have some degree of independence from the base phenomena. And I think trying to capture exactly what that is part of the challenge of explaining what emergence is. There's a sense in which if you've got all the same base level phenomena, you should have the higher level phenomena. And I think this is because for emergence we need some notion of the emergent phenomena actually does emerge from or is dependent upon the lower level phenomena, but nevertheless still with a degree of independence. Now, if you are to go for any kind of emergent position at all, I think it means that you are committed in some sense to this idea of higher and lower level phenomena, and explaining that is also it's not a small job. So there are some people who talk as if there are some levels in nature, that the world is stratified, and I'm not so keen on that, because I think of the world as more continuous than having distinct joints. But nevertheless, I think we can make sense of higher and lower level in terms of part-whole relations. So I think a whole is, in a sense, a higher level phenomenon than its proper parts, because, well, as it suggests, the parts are part of the whole. They constitute the whole. So I think it may be possible to redeem the notion of levels in nature sufficiently to make some sense of emergence. Another issue that interests me, and I really want to bring this in with the topic of emergence, is the issue of top-down causation, because one thing that is important about emergent phenomena, it seems, is that it creates the possibility of top-down causation. Now, reductionists are people who would accept that there are levels in nature, but that every relatively higher phenomenon is explained in terms of a relatively lower phenomenon. So this seems to be a commitment in reductionism that all causation is bottom-up. So, for instance, a reductionist may say something like, well, if a person is stressed, then the explanation should be in terms of a chemical imbalance in their brain or in their body, for instance. So every phenomenon is going to be explained by a relatively lower level mechanistic explanation. Now, I think there's plenty of empirical evidence to suggest that reductionism, or this aspect of reductionism, doesn't seem to work. So cases such as, for instance, we think that stress, so if a person is stressed, it can lead to biological changes in their body. So rather than having a reductionist explanation that's all bottom-up, it seems that here a top-down explanation seems to work. And I accept this seems common sense and empirical evidence that suggests that downward causation does work in practice. The philosophical task, I think, is to explain how it works in theory, and that's no easy matter. Now, it's hard, I think, to see how you could accept downward causation unless you also allowed emergent phenomena that had a degree of independence from their base level phenomena, or from their base. But of course, the emergentist isn't committed to there being downward causation. You could think, for instance, that emergent phenomena were purely epiphenomenal, which would be a case where they didn't have any lower level effects. They could have lower level causes, but no lower level effects. Now, I think I might be able to offer some new insight into this debate, partly because of some views that I've got on the nature of causation, which I've developed with Rani Lilanian. For instance, issues of emergence versus reductionism. So there's that issue. Does the world include emergent phenomena, or is it all reducible to lower level phenomena? And then there's the issue of top-down versus bottom-up causation. Is all causation bottom-up, or is there some top-down causation? These have been traditionally separated on the grounds that the question of emergence seems to concern a synchronous relation, because I think emergence has usually been understood in terms of constitution, and it's been understood in terms of whether wholes are more than sums of their parts. Whereas the issue of top-down versus bottom-up causation, as it concerns causation, is seen as concerning a diachronic relation, because it's orthodox to assume that causes precede their effects in time. So this is a standard empiricist account of causation that you find way back in David Hume, for instance. Now, if causes are temporarily prior to their effects, then it could provide some reason to say whether stress caused the bodily disturbance or the bodily disturbance caused the stress, because you could just look at which occurred first. But the view that we developed in getting causes from powers supports the idea that causation is simultaneous. Causes are simultaneous with their effects, in which case causation would come out as a broadly synchronous matter. So this would be a synchronous matter, not where two things are occurring at the same time or at the same moment in time, because causes and effects can involve temporally extended processes. But those, the process which is the cause and the process which is the effect, have the same starting point and end point in time. So they're synchronous in that sense. They occur at the same time. Now, then you might think, okay, well, does that mean we've got two different interlevel relations that are synchronous? Is there constitution and is there causation? Or should we say that they amount to the same? And should we understand emergence in terms of them? Well, what I'm going to say is that these two relations are closer than is traditionally thought. But that what's going on in the case of emergence, it is a very special case of bottom-up causation, but it's not merely the same as constitution, because we want to argue that something occurs in cases of emergence that is more than simply parts being assembled. So I'll move on to explain what I mean there. So I'm now starting section 4 of the handout, emergent causal powers. So I think one of the challenges is to, certainly for a strong emergentist, is to explain what is going on in case of emergent phenomena that is more than just part and whole. Because just to say that the whole has some property that the parts lack, I think is too weak and would make emergent phenomena too ubiquitous. Because if you take the case of what can be called specific value emergence, this could be something as trivial as a case where a whole weighs 10 pounds, though none of its parts do. Now, if that's going to count as emergence, I think it's such a weak form, and it's going to be true of almost every whole. It's just going to have that kind of property which the parts don't have. So what do you need more than that? Now, there are some cases where wholes compose in a non-linear way. So this is a case where you can add certain things together, and the parts aggregate in a non-linear way. So there they do become a lot more than the sum of the parts, or in some non-linear cases a lot less than the sum of the parts, because the example I got on the handout is that if you eat 10 candy bars, it doesn't produce 10 times the pleasure of the one candy bar. Now, non-linearity, I think, is a very interesting phenomenon, but I still think there's something about it that isn't special enough to really qualify as a strong form of emergence. It's more about the mode of composition is not additive, it's composing by some other function. But I still think it's questionable whether there's any genuine novelty that would qualify as a form of emergence. Another form of emergence that's being discussed is what we can call modest kind emergence, and this is where the whole has some property that's different from the properties of the parts. Now, I also think that this is a relatively weak form of emergence. So you could think of a tabletop that's composed of two right-angled triangles. And if they're put together in the right way, the top of the table will be square. So there the whole, the table, has a property of squareness that none of the parts have. So that's an interesting kind of case. But you could argue that there's not really anything more to it than just having the parts arranged in the right way. And there's no really special novelty. So what we need is some form, I think, of radical kind emergence. And I think causation is the key to this. And this very special kind of causation. Because what I've got in mind is that there are some powers of wholes possessed by wholes, and they're possessed only because of their parts entering into a very special relationship. Okay, so what I've got in mind then is that a fairly dynamic account where what's happening for a genuine emergence is that the parts are interacting and that through that interaction, through that appropriate relatedness, a new causal power emerges that can only be possessed through that interaction. So let me give some examples of the sort of thing I'm talking about. A very simple case is the case of chemical bonding. Now, let's take a very simple case of H2O water. Now, there, I think there is a sense in which through the chemical bonding, which is a process that takes time, there is a transformation of the parts. We all know that a H2O molecule is in some sense made of two hydrogen atoms and one oxygen atom. But there's also a sense in which hydrogen and oxygen no longer exist once they've chemically bonded. And the reason for that is that they've undergone a transformation. Both hydrogen and oxygen are highly flammable. You wouldn't want to pour any hydrogen or oxygen onto a fire, for instance, but you would want to pour water on it. So it seems that water has some causal power that is not possessed by its parts, and also it doesn't possess the causal powers of the parts. And why is that? Well, if you look at the structure of an H2O molecule, you can see that all the atoms involved are partaking of a causal relation. They are sharing electrons in their outer shell. And given that vacant spaces on the outer shell of electrons explains some of the chemical causal powers of atoms, then it becomes perfectly understandable why the chemical properties have changed through that bonding. Another case I've got on the handout is chlorine and sodium, both of which are very dangerous. And you would think that if wholes simply added together the causal powers of the parts, that sodium chloride would be an extremely dangerous thing. It is fairly dangerous, but it's just common salt, so it's not going to kill you as readily as sodium would and chlorine would on their own. So it's clear that some kind of transformation has occurred. And this is a dynamic view, we think, because the electrons are whizzing around the atoms. We can't really explain chemical properties in an entirely static way. And it explains how we can have causal powers of wholes that are not possessed of parts. So this is a view I prefer, just to deviate from the handout for a second. I prefer this view, for instance, to Jessica Wilson's subset view, where she thinks the causal powers of the emergent phenomena are a subset of the causal powers of the whole. But here I've got a sense of emergence in which there is something in the causal powers of the whole that's not possessed by the causal powers of the parts. Now, let me give the example for a case of social phenomenon that also illustrates the other key concept I wanted to get across, which is demergence. So I think social science provides a wealth of examples that illustrate how this sort of a case works. But the phenomena I want to concentrate on is language, linguistic phenomena, which I think are emergent. So first of all, just to explain how this works, well, I think we have to accept that while societies are constituted by a plurality of individuals, it's also vital that those individuals stand in a certain relation. And specifically, I think the plurality of individuals has to be an interacting plurality. So I think the very notion of a society is a causal notion, because unless those members are causally interacting, changing each other's behaviour, then they don't count as a society. What we do affects other people, and what other people do affect us. Now let's consider the case of language. So Wittgenstein in the Philosophical Investigations presented what's been known as the private language argument. And this tells us that a solitary individual would not be able to either create or sustain a language on his or her own. Because language is normative, language carries meaning where there is a correct and incorrect meaning. And it's only through our interaction with other people that those norms of meaning can be enforced. If I was a solitary individual trying to run my private language, then I could misuse a term and there's no one there to correct me and tell me that I'm misusing a term. So language seems to crucially rely on us being part of a society. It's a social phenomenon. And it's a higher level phenomenon, and I'm going to say emergent. And it's emergent in the sense that no one individual could create or sustain that language. So it's a linguistic phenomena, are something that comes essentially from the interaction of those individuals. And here's the notion of demergence then. So what's crucial is that once that higher level phenomena exists, it causally affects us. So I have a property of being a language user, which I can only possess through partaking of a greater whole. I couldn't be a language user if I was a solitary individual who hadn't partook of a whole and been involved in the creation and sustaining of a language. So that's what we mean by a demergent phenomenon. And I think critical realists have a similar notion which they call infrastructuration. So I think I'm viewing the situation in a slightly different way from as often standard in a lot of this debate. So thinking of the emergent phenomena are causally explained, so they are explicable, whereas some notions of emergence try to make it in terms of the higher level phenomena are inexplicable in terms of the lower phenomena. So I think in theory the higher level interactions are perfectly explicable because they're caused bottom up by lower level phenomena. But what's special about emergent phenomena is that bottom up phenomena have been created which then have the causal power, downwards causal powers, to affect the constituent parts of those wholes. So it can be a fairly sort of complicated picture that I'm describing there, where bottom up the emergent phenomena are created, and they're emergent in the sense that they have the power to cause things top down and create these demergent phenomena. Okay, now I said a short while ago that we know that emergence seems to work in practice, but the problem is how it works in theory. So having told you roughly what I think emergent phenomena are, I don't want to pretend that that means everything's solved and everything's easy. So there are a number of notorious problems that we have when we accept emergent phenomena. If we're accepting that there are emergent phenomena with causal powers capable of downward causation, then it does create problems about the causal closure principle, for instance. Now, this has seemed especially pressing in the case of mental phenomena. So there are some emergentists who think that a very good example of an emergent phenomenon is the mind. Mental phenomena would be emergent from physical phenomena and also capable of exerting a downward causal influence. So if I make a decision to leave this room, then I can carry my body, I can carry my molecules out of the room with me. That looks like it would be a case of downward causation from the mental to the physical. But the problem is this seems to violate the principle of causal closure. So this would be a principle that the cause of every physical phenomena is another physical phenomena. And so it looks as if you're denying physicalism if you allow emergence about the mental and allow that it's capable of downward causal influence. Now, there are various possible responses to this. For instance, you could allow that effects are overdetermined, that effects have both a physical cause and a mental cause. But some people find that unattractive because they don't want a position in which events are regularly, systematically, causally overdetermined. Jessica Wilson thinks that the subset view is one response to this problem of the causal closure of the physical. Now, my view on this is that I think once we get away from the question of the mental and the physical and mental phenomena, it starts to look a bit less emotive, because I think some of the emergent phenomena I've described are perfectly physical. So if you look at emergent phenomena in chemistry, for instance, this emergent causal powers, we're not saying that there's anything non-physical about those properties. Similarly, in the case of social phenomena, everything's physical in the sense it could be perfectly physically explicable, but what I'm explaining is how the emergent phenomena are generated. So I prefer to talk about whether there's a principle of the causal closure of the basal level. Instead of speaking of physical level, the question is whether the base level is causally closed, which is another way of saying that the question is whether all causation is explicable at the base level, at the lowest level. And that seems to make the issue sound less emotive, because I'm not challenging physicalism. And once I ask that question, is everything explicable at the base level? Well, no, I've already said enough. I've already made it clear why I reject that, because I think there are some causal powers of wholes that are more than the causal powers of the parts. The case of sodium chloride showed that. So in the chemical bonding, the transformation has resulted in a new causal power which is able to have certain effects, including effects on the parts. There's a transformation of the parts, as in the case of the H2O, the hydrogen and oxygen atoms get transformed by partaking in the whole. Similarly, I get transformed by partaking of a language-using community. I've now become a language user. Arguably, I can only think because I'm part of a language-using community. So this starts to look more plausible, and what I'm saying is plausible is that the way to solve the problem, on the handout I've put it in the terms that Yagwon Kim set up. I'm saying that the way to solve the problem is indeed to deny the causal closure of the basal level. So I'm saying that the bottom level is not causally closed, in the sense that higher level phenomena can change lower level phenomena and leave them with demergent properties.